Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. Brazil is the topic of this episode. Our guests are John Thamert, Chris Tanner, Ken Wood, and Romolo Lolato. Brazil is the fifth largest country in the world and the seventh most populous. Its vast land area is abundant in natural resources. The country is the world's leader in coffee production and export, sugarcane production, soybean production and exports, and orange production, just to name a few. Brazil is an agricultural giant, and that giant is growing. USDA projects an additional 20 million hectares or 50 million acres of cropland will be brought into production by 2031. In February, the Kansas Agriculture and Rural Leadership Program hosted an Ag Experience tour to Brazil. Over 40 people traveled across key agricultural regions of Brazil over the course of 14 days. On this episode of Wheats on Your Mind, we've assembled a panel of attendees from that trip. Our guests are John Thamert from Sylvan Grove, Kansas, Chris Tanner from Norton, Ken Wood from Manhattan, and Romolo Lolato with Kansas State University. So, gentlemen, thanks for joining us. I think, to be fair, before we get an American perspective on what we see, we'll turn to our favorite Brazilian, Romolo. And you know, we went to a lot of places over the course of 14 days, and Romolo, you had not been to all these places, but it's just like me saying I live in the U.S. and I've never been to Las Vegas. You haven't been to the whole country of Brazil. It is a big country. So from your perspective as a native, what did you see that maybe surprised you with what you had seen in Brazil?
Yeah, well, thanks, Aaron, for having me here today. It's a great pleasure to be touching base, especially on a subject that I love so much. And perhaps what surprised me the most, and you're right on, it's a huge country, continental proportions, and while I had traveled quite a bit in there, I had not been to every single place that we have been in this trip. So many of the things that we saw were eye-opening to me, but perhaps from my perspective, what I was most surprised with was with the Mato Grosso region and how much it has changed since the last time I've been there. So just for context, right, those cities in the Mato Grosso region, they really haven't started in the last 40 years or so. It's a fairly recent development. And the last time that I had been there was around 2010, so just like 13, 14 years ago. And some of those small towns that we drove by that used to be small towns, that they were 10, 15,000 people back in 2010, today, just like 14 years later, they are 90 plus thousand people. So the development that we saw there, and that's all driven by ag. A lot of new industries that were developed since the last time that I had been there as well, due to a lot of changes in the dynamics in the crop production in that region. It has been just amazing to see in terms of how we're trying to make the most use of what we are producing internally and locally there as well. Just so the development of that region, which was driven by agriculture, it's what surprised me the most.
And what do you find compares between Brazilian and American farmers? You've obviously dealt with both. What are the similarities and what are the differences?
Well, I think that, similarities just love for what you're doing, right? If you are a farmer, you need to love what you are doing, and I think that that's something that we have in common, almost irrespective where we are in the world, and more specifically in Brazil and in the US, right? You really need to love it, because you've never been to Las Vegas, but if you're a farmer, you're betting every single day because of the weather, right? So you're putting all that investment down, and it all comes down to Mother Nature in the end as well. And so you really need to love what you're doing. And that's with a few family farms that we visited there, and even the larger farms as well. That's kind of what we could feel. Just like whether it was an orange producer or a coffee producer or a soybean and corn producer, they all just seemed to love what they were doing. And I think that that's the most thing that we have in common with the farmers here in Kansas as well.
So, John Thamert, what were your expectations going into the trip? I believe this was your first time to Brazil. What made the biggest impression on you?
Yeah, Aaron, thanks for doing this. It's good to have the rest of the panel all together. I was blown away by the trip. I expected I expect a lot more differentiation across the whole country. I expected soils to be quite a bit different. I expected the climate to be quite a bit different. I was impressed by the homogeneous nature of the soil from one end of the country to the other. I was impressed by how much rainfall they got. It was interesting to see the development of Brazil along the scale. As they say, Brazil is a developing country. The BRICS, part of the BRICS, the first letter of the BRICS connotation. Agriculture is the first step, the first development, the first industry, and they're going gangbusters on that. So I was just impressed by their productive capacity and how much they are growing.
Ken, your impressions of Brazil, what did you see from a farming perspective that you found you could relate to the most with what you did when you were farming?
Well, I think I was most impressed with the Mato Grosso area, but I didn't relate that well to it because the scale of that was way different than what I had ever been around. I was probably more familiar the further south we went, maybe not with the wineries and that sort of thing in Rio Grande do Sul, but the hillier terrain, more livestock mixed in, more pastures mixed in with farm ground and that sort of thing. But the Mato Grosso thing was, I sort of expected something like that, but I was blown away by how much bigger it seemed to me than what I thought it was going to be, I guess. Just the scale, the size of the operations, the flatness of the terrain, the amount of rainfall that they get, that's hard for me to wrap my brain around. They were talking 80, basically the equivalent of 80 inches of rain. At home, if we had 40 inches of rain, we'd be underwater a good bit of the time because we'd be flooding, because that's more than we normally get. So there were a lot of things that I don't know what my expectations were, but I was really surprised by a few things down there.
So, Chris, in Norton, Kansas, how many years does it take you to get 80 inches of rain?
Oh, I would say knocking on the door of 6. But, and if we had 80 inches, kind of much to Ken's point, we'd have a different set of problems.
Yeah. What was your impressions of Brazil agriculture overall?
So I kind of went in blind, and in fact, I hate to say this, but I didn't even thoroughly review the itinerary going because I knew I was going with a good group of people and was certain no one would leave me behind. But, you know, the purpose of me wanting to go on the trip was obviously to see Romolo's home country, and to have that opportunity to travel with someone of that caliber is something you don't just pass by. As a younger producer, you know, we always hear things on the radio all the time or TV about Brazilian agriculture and how it affects ours. And I guess I kind of was going to, you know, wanted to go along to see it with my own eyes. And, you know, at the end of the day, they're plagued with the same challenges we are with, you know, government regulation, labor, all of these things. The realization that between American farmers and Brazilian farmers, you know, hand in hand, we will feed the globe together through the challenges as producers that we face every day.
Our producer of this podcast, Dave Deacon, would have felt right at home in Brazil because the soil is red, probably redder than the soil at Oklahoma. Romolo, why is that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The majority of the soils in Brazil, and as John was mentioning, very uniform kind of across the country. And I think that it's uniformly, can say, oxidized, right? So it's a very old and weathered soil. And with that amount of rainfall that ranges from probably 60 to 80 inches a year, as Ken was mentioning, a lot of the good stuff leached down, right? And so that those soils, they are very heavy clay, 60, 70+% clay. And it's a different clay than what we have here in the U.S. It's a clay that doesn't expand as much, and so we need more organic matter to keep the nutrients there and to keep the same water holding capacity. But essentially, it's a more oxidized soil. It's a very acidic soil as well. And with that, many of the nutrients, for example, phosphorus, right? In our own farm, back home, if you go to the forest there and you sample, it's about 1 ppm to 2 ppm phos in the original values that we have. So it's very oxidized simply because of 80 inches of rain every year for thousands and thousands of years, right? And so Chris mentioned that if they had 80 inches of rain in Norton, they would have another set of problems, right? And that's exactly what happens. So usually water availability is not a concern, but then we do have poor soils that don't hold as much water. They're deep soils, but they're very acidic, and the deeper you go, they become more acid because it's not a acidity that developed because just of nitrogen application over 100 years. It really is just naturally acidic soils. That coupled with, depending where you are in the country, right, the slopes that we have, they lead to a lot of erosion. And that's part of the reason why no-till has been so widely adopted there. 90+% of the grain production in country happens under no-till, simply because with your eyes, you don't want to see that topsoil, rich topsoil, just being eroded away. And trust me, being as red as it is, we definitely see that if we have those 4-inch an hour rainfall. So those are the set of problems that we kind of work with, very acidic soils that become worse in depth. You need to no-till, so how do you deal with that acidity, right? And so different set of challenges for production agriculture down there.
Before we get more into the aspects of agriculture, give us a brief review of what a crop rotation looks like in Mato Grosso.
So in Mato Grosso, just to give some perspective, right? Mato Grosso, if it was a country on its own, it would be the third largest soybean producer in the world, just like after U.S. and the rest of Brazil, and even before Argentina. So that's how much soybean is produced out of Mato Grosso itself, right? And those 80 inches of rainfall that fall down every year, they are very concentrated from mid-September through mid-April. Now, outside of that window, it's like zero rainfall, right? It's completely dry. So the winter there is dry. The winter that goes from May through August there, it's very dry. Not cold, but dry. That's how the seasons are defined. So to make the most use out of those 80 inches that come between September and April, in the past, producers used to plant a long season soybeans. Planted mid-October, had a good stand establishment, and harvest sometime in February there. Now, the biggest change that started to happen in the early 2000s there, 2005 to 2010 roughly, was pushing that soybean crop early. So instead of planting mid-October, you're now pushing it to mid-September, using a shorter soybean crop that could be harvested by early January or mid-January. And that would allow for a second season corn crop to be planted, right? And as long as the corn crop was tasseling by mid-April or so, when rainfalls were shutting down, it would still be a fairly decent second season corn, or what we call safrinha. Now, safrinha actually means small season, right? So a smaller season than the first one, which used to be that way. But once the growers in Mato Grosso figured out they could actually pull two crops out of the same season just by planting earlier that soybean crop and a shorter season soybean, and then make sure that as they are harvesting, and we saw that, as they are harvesting, the planter is just right behind it and planting that corn crop right away. Brazil went from being a net importer of corn to started exporting corn. And perhaps what was more interestingly to me, at least, was seeing that we're not just exporting, we're actually developing the industry locally to use it there. So we saw a lot of ethanol plants being developed in the Mato Grosso region. We also saw feedlots of Brahma cattle that they were not, trust me, there was no talk about these 14 years ago, last time that I was there. So really this dynamic of planting an early season soybean, short season soybean early, getting that done by mid-January, planting a short cycle corn right then, and you might still be able to get 130, 140 bushel per acre on that corn. That really changed the dynamics in that region.
It is intensive agriculture, and they do have a lot more water to work with, obviously. Ken, what struck you as is most fascinating about the number of inputs that they had to use on their crop?
And we started talking about the use of fungicides and the acidity that Romolo talked about. You know, they've got to apply lime by the tons, literally, to make that work, but they were talking 4 and 5 applications of fungicide because of the humidity and the temperature situation on a soybean crop. And when we first went there, a lot of the stuff that I saw were advantages that they had, but then the longer you're around it, you start to see some of the challenges that they have, and that was one of them and I can't imagine what our situation would be with that kind of rainfall and that kind of temperature. I would think weeds would be like on steroids compared to what we have to deal with. So the rainfall is a blessing to them, but there's also a downside to every good thing that happens. There's always an unintended or a not so advantageous kind of a consequence.
Chris, they've seen soybean diseases we haven't even heard of, and they said we're just starting to see glyphosate resistance in weeds. In your opinion, what are some of the other challenges they're going to face here in the short term and long term?
Well, with the, production of soybeans, they talked about the nematodes and some other things that are, possibly causing a yield drag. And, they're already using BT soybeans, which aren't even heard of here in the United States. One thing that fascinated me, and I don't want to jump subjects, but their eagerness and how they're implementing biologicals into their farming rotation to kind of try and combat some of these things naturally, and some of the technologies they're using there are light years ahead of the biologicals in the United States. Those are a couple things that really jumped out at me that I think they're doing right.
Biologicals were a big deal, Romolo, and I suppose that ties somewhat to the poor soil conditions, doesn't it?
I have the impression that it does, Aaron, and as Chris was mentioning, it seems like every other farm that we visited, they were producing their own biologicals, right? They have a tank where they were fermenting different things there and kind of using that in their own production system. And so it seems the more and more growers, and not only growers, but companies, of course, but also researchers that I interact with in Brazil, it just seems like over there, biologicals are really kind of taking over. And there's good research there for showing that some of the biologicals that they are using actually make a difference. For example, the Embrapa, which is kind of our version of the USDA in Brazil, they published a 10-year study recently here showing the benefits of azospirillum, which is a nitrogen-fixing bacteria, but for corn. Right, we're used to think about the soybean being inoculated, but here they're really talking about putting it on the corn and how that can actually save some costs for the grower in terms of nitrogen applications in season. And that was really good data out there. Now, we did try that product here in Kansas as well for wheat, right? We tried it for a couple or 3 years actually in my own program, and we didn't see much of that benefit here. Now, why is that? Is it because our soils can already provide more here than over there? Or perhaps it's the weather as well, right? We're talking about, in that case, specifically tropical bacteria that might not survive our winters out here. So many things that just like are very environment and soil specific that perhaps makes it work more often there than maybe what we see up here.
So, John, you were in the field and you saw the same day where they were, harvesting and planting and applying lime and deep ripping at the same time, just really intensive production. Let's talk in terms of competitiveness. I know when I started the trip, I was thinking, boy, these guys are going to stomp us in competitive agriculture in the next few decades, but then maybe we saw some of the challenges that they also face going along on the trip. Give us your impressions of how Brazil and the U.S. are going to butt heads in competition the next decade.
Well, Aaron, I would say it's not a matter of they're going to stomp us. I think they're stomping us right now. When Romolo mentioned the rotation, I think it's important. When we think of rotations, we think of we'll plant this part to one crop and that part to another. They're planting the whole field to soybeans. They pull the beans off and they come in with a second crop corn. They're planting the whole farm like that. Is that accurate, Romolo?
That is accurate, yes, John. Yeah, in the same year, they would do 2, sometimes 3 crops.
Then the production of those crops are what we would normally think is double crop, at least not in Kansas. They're excellent production. So they're getting excellent production out of every acre. And so extremely competitive. They're going to have their issues to contend with. They've got their issues to contend with. Soil quality is one, but when you get 60 to 80 inches of rainfall a year, you can put up with a lot of poor quality soils. I have to think of western Kansas before they found irrigation under it. You could buy ground out in southwest Kansas for not a whole lot of money. I remember hearing stories of $5 to $10 an acre, and then they found water underneath it, and poor quality sandy soils were producing fantastic corn crop, and so I think that that rainfall makes a world of difference. So they've got a lot of advantages. One of the things that really struck me, and Aaron, you mentioned we went to the farm where they were harvesting, tillage, chopping stalks, and then planting all in the same day. We went to that one area before that, 5,000-acre field, and it had rained the day before. And if I remember, it was about 1.5 inches of rain. I thought, well, we're not going to go to the field tomorrow. No, we drove the bus in the field. They were harvesting soybeans with, I think, three or four combines, at least three, and the 45-foot draper platforms, and then they were planting corn just a little ways away. 5,000-acre field, inch and a half of rain, being able to walk in it, not track. I was just amazed at that, at the absorption of that soil. And in our area, if you have red clay like that, you're not going to get in it that quick. They've got some disadvantages as far as soil quality, but the annual rainfall makes a big difference.
What's the difference there, Romolo? I mean, what in that structure allows them to get in the fields that quickly?
Not exactly sure. That always puzzled me how here roads are. I have gotten stuck more often than I like to admit here in the U.S., probably because I think I can drive through, and I forgot that I'm driving a van to start with, right. An extension van. But I think that we just have less silt in the soil, and silt makes a big difference in terms of the water holding capacity of that soil, but also how slippery that soil is. Yep, I'll probably blame on the silt.
So, Ken, farmers in the U.S. and farmers in Brazil all operate under a regulatory umbrella. There was no difference in that. Let's go to the northern Mato Grosso where it borders the Amazon. I was fascinated by this. So if a farmer buys 100 acres of forest, they can only farm 20 of it, and the other 80% they have leave set. So particularly the first farm we stopped with, it was interesting. These farmers had been blacklisted, I guess was the best term, on exports by some major corporations. Did that shock you? What was the story behind that?
I don't know if I know the story behind it, but it was interesting. It sounded like the corporations basically were using a standard, kind of a European standard about, I want to say sustainability, but in that realm anyway. But the fact that they were singled out, I thought we were going to learn some Portuguese swear words maybe at that point. They were pretty upset. And somebody made the comment that almost sounded like mafia or organized crime kind of a thing, and it almost did sound a little that way. I don't know. I'm assuming they were going to work through it. People have a way of working around things, but it definitely was a inconvenience at best, and just a blatant attempt to take over some of their marketing options is what it amounted to. I didn't completely understand how that all came to be. I mean, I don't think I could speak intelligently about that part of it, but it didn't take long to figure out. And I was standing next to Chris when they were doing this discussion, and Chris said, "Watch his body language." And the guy, as he was talking about it, you could tell. I mean, he just bristled up when he started talking about that. And I don't know. We talk about our regulatory problems here. It sounds like they have a lot of the same kind of things. I don't think we have that situation here where you're basically told you can't sell something. When we were getting ready for this trip, we got exposed a little bit to some of the Brazilian governmental bureaucracy when we were trying to get our visas, and some people never did get them. So, that was pretty frustrating. We wondered, how the trip was actually going to take place for a while, but I kept thinking the whole time he was talking about that, I thought, that's a real thing. It's not something that he's imagining. I mean, this is a real hit to their bottom line and to their ability to do what they want to do, and what they do pretty well. So I don't know the backstory. I would be interested to hear more about that. We had people interpreting what he said, but sometimes you kind of lose a little in the translation, and I wasn't sure exactly how that all played out.
Well, Chris, you're a body language expert. What was making him the most mad?
I would say just the translation part, you couldn't tell what they were saying, but you could watch and see, and, basically being told you can't sell your crops and being dictated what you're going to do by the government and the European Union. I kind of want to circle back to the fact that, what John said, in a production standpoint, they really know how to raise grain, but governmental regulation and the way their hands are tied is what's going to hurt the producers over there. And I think every farm we walked across, it wasn't problems with taxation or whatever else. It's the ability to farm and trade grain, and their government is standing in their way.
I think more details on the background on that story, that European Union guidelines were driving some of these corporations to demand certain farming practices from farmers to be able to export their grain, and this farm wasn't making the cut, and therefore they were blacklisted. They could still sell commodities into the local marketplace, but then we did ask, why is the Brazilian government allowing this? And they said, well, there's just a lot of sway from those corporations, so the government didn't really do anything about it. Romolo, at that first farm, there was a little relay an anecdote to us. I saw a little bundle of Amazon tree seedlings there. Tell us what that was all about.
Yeah, no, and before telling about that, I will mention that we were trying to keep the translation kind of PG-13. so we were filtering some stuff there. So definitely that body language, Chris, it was reflecting what they were saying. But as means of background here, back in 2008, right, that's when Europe, I think, started saying that they were not going to import soybeans that were produced in the Amazon, right? And so the company started kind of like using satellite images to see where the Amazon was being opened up, new areas, and then going to check who was the farmer opening that up, right? And then boycotting those farmers. Now, at that point in time, it was fairly difficult for them to do that because there was no system where every single piece of land was registered for somebody that could be checked online, right? So they needed to go in the farm and knock there and see who was the owner, which has a lot of challenges, right, if you're in the middle of the forest. Now, today, where all the land in Brazil there's an electronic system where you can just click there and see who owns it. It's much easier to just do that system where if you notice that a given farmer is opening a piece of land, the company doesn't buy from that farmer, right? It is definitely an issue. And that story that you were asking about, those little trees that we were seeing, so apparently these farmers, they purchased a new planter that was larger than their old ones, and there was a small kind of 2-acre plot that they could not plant without maneuvering quite a bit on this new drill. So they opened up not even 2 acres or so of new land there, right, just to be able to kind of turn that around and continue planting continuously. And this was by their headquarters, probably 300 feet away from their headquarters, right? In that very same year, companies came down and they boycott their field. So, okay, well, from this field here, we can't buy anything. And if you want us to get back to buying from you here, you need to replant that area that you opened up. So that's what those little tree seedlings that we saw were for. They were going to replant that right after the season so they could get back to business with those companies.
I guess we've seen that here, haven't we, Ken? John, what's the U.S. program back in history where if you had to, your base acres, right? You couldn't plant beyond that, or they made you till them up?
You were allowed so many acres. That was back in production control time, and we've gotten away from that a little bit, quite a bit actually. The common thread among producers is every one of them flinched when they talked about government regulation. And, we can all relate to that. They chafed at that, and they chafed about taxes. And, that's something we can relate to. The thing that I probably found interesting as well was, you hear the European Union and you hear the climate activists talk about, they're breaking out the Amazon rainforest and they're tearing up savanna. Well, we did the same thing in the States, and Aaron, you alluded to that. The Ohio Valley was deforested. Think about Kansas. We took out a lot of bluestem and buffalo grass and turned it into farmland. That's part of development. I cannot blame them one bit for doing that. That's how they're expanding their economy. They're growing their agricultural base. And anybody that faults them for that, I think, is being hypocritical, because every developed country in the world has done that as they were developing. So I just love the entrepreneurial spirit of a farmer. I love their chafing at regulatory issues. And yeah, we need some regulation, but some of it goes overboard. It was just an interesting set of circumstances to kind of look back at probably where we were in the States 100 years ago, or maybe more, as far as breaking out ground and what they've done.
Yeah, I think it is fair. Brazil's at a point where U.S. agriculture was several decades ago, and I think that's exemplified by we were in a town called Sinop in Mato Grosso, about 60,000 people. Is that correct? The town didn't exist 4 years ago. It was in the middle of nowhere, and it's all building up around agriculture. But they do have their logistic challenges. There's a highway that runs from Mato Grosso south that is a 2-lane highway, runs all the way to the ocean, doesn't it, Romolo?
It goes north all the way to the ocean,
Yeah.
and it goes south. I don't remember now where it stops, but logistics.
It's BR 163, the highway, and it's a 2-lane road, a narrow 2-lane road, head-to-head traffic. Used to be gravel. It was paved not too long ago, and it is just tandem trailer grain trucks zooming back and forth constantly on that highway, and frankly, driving in the tourist bus on that road scared me a little bit. I mean, it's a dangerous road, but what would happen if they would build a 4-lane highway or even a railroad?
Oh, the change would be dramatic, and it's, to me, from the outside looking in, that looks like there is an answer to that problem. It's just a matter of I guess, the powers that be thinking that it's important enough to make that a priority. Around Sao Paulo, I thought the roads were, fairly modern, kind of like what we're used to, but that was a main artery out of that. You think about the production that comes out of that state, and it's pretty much all going up and down that single highway. Just blows my mind. What the amount of traffic that could be alleviated by having a railroad that would take stuff to port would just, it's just, that one's a little hard to figure out why I know the area's new, the production is new and all that. There's been a big change in that, but if they figure that out, then Katie bar the door, they're really going to be in good shape, because they can get inputs in there easier, they can get their product out easier. That's got to be holding them back.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of research after the fact, and there is a plan for a short railroad line there, and what holding it back is the indigenous people and destruction of the Amazon. So that's not too surprising.
Yeah, and I think just to give a perspective of how long, right, those trucks are driving until they get to the nearest port, right? Think about it, is one truck of soybeans that is driving 1,000 miles until they get to the port up north, or 100 or 1,100 miles or 1,200 miles if they're going south. So yes, it's transportation is definitely still our biggest bottleneck.
What else do you think, Chris, is holding the Brazilian farmer back personally and the country as a whole? We've got our own, blessed with a great transportation system here in the central United States, but we can be challenged by freight rates and cost of inputs and everything. What are some of the handcuffs, so to speak, on Brazilian agriculture that might be slowing down their expansion?
I would say probably access to capital. A lot of people, they didn't use banks. They would bank things, and their currency was bags of beans. So, I would say from a farmer's perspective, access to capital, but that's from an American standard too. I mean, every farm we're on there, it's pretty well that's the currency that they used, but it seemed to me that the small farmers, small to mid-sized, were kind of getting squeezed out by the mega farms, but oddly enough, they're the ones that ran the co-ops and provided the smaller farmers with the capital. So it seems to me that the larger are getting larger and the small are getting squeezed out, and as that continues to take place, that could limit production just due to the fact that you don't have as much competition.
Yeah, same question for you, John. I'll spin it a little bit and put you on the spot. If you were given the opportunity to invest in agriculture in Brazil, would you take the opportunity, or how would you go about doing that?
I thought about it as a young man a number of years ago. I'm not a young man anymore, as you all know. I knew some people that did buy some property there, and that was back in the days when land was nationalized in Brazil, and I don't know if that still happens, but I do believe there's opportunities to invest there. But I do believe the transportation issue is huge, and I have to think of what that would do to the communities. That's one thing that in the development of our country, railroads plotted a line and then federal government gave them a checkerboard of land all along either side of that line. And that's how railroads became extremely wealthy and extremely powerful. And that's how we settled a lot of the hinterlands in our country. And I can imagine something like that taking place in Brazil. I do think there's opportunities to invest in Brazil. I thought one of the most interesting comments that I took away from our visit to the Agricultural University or University of Sao Paulo was that we asked why there weren't more railroads. And the speaker told us, well, we have the tire lobby and we have the truck lobby, and the government doesn't want to see labor displaced because there would be a lot of people without jobs. So I can understand that, but I think it's just a matter of time before railroad investment opportunities are available. It seems to me, and Romolo, you could straighten me out on this, and I hope this is the case, it seems to me that Brazil is strongly nationalist. I mean, we hear about how China's going to develop Brazil, and we hear about other things that may happen. I didn't get a sense of that at all. I felt like no, we're going to do this ourselves. We're going to make this work. So to answer the question, yeah, I think there's investment opportunities, but I have a question for maybe Romolo can clear that up. Is that a fair observation that Brazil is strongly nationalist and doesn't really want outside investment unless it's no strings attached?
Yeah, John, I am not sure that I'm very well capable to answer that. I see a big change from when I go visit now that I usually go once a year, right? From the when I was living there 14 years ago, it was like we have a higher Chinese presence in ag there, but I don't think that we are in a position like what we hear in some countries in Africa, right? That they just completely exchange land use for 100 years for development of the infrastructure. I don't think that would ever happen there. But to some extent, I think that there is a much larger presence of some Chinese industry there today than there was a couple of decades ago.
It did strike me that the farmers were pretty independent, much like our Kansas farmers are, and I don't know that anybody specifically asked them the China question, but the farms we went to were very family oriented. While large, they were in my opinion very comparable to what we see here in the United States. Let's transition a little bit to research. So I was impressed by the university we visited. We also visited a very large farmer-owned cooperative that was a dairy cooperative, but went way beyond that into crop production. And Chris, you jumped into a pit they had dug in one of the fields with red soil. What was your overall impression of the expertise and how they communicate that research to their farmers and how their farmers adopt that research?
It almost seems to me that their extension process is a lot more readily accepted there than here. Obviously, and I think Romolo probably took us to a lot of cutting-edge farmers and things as well. But soil health and efficiencies, looking to be more productive, mindful of their topsoil. It seemed, the producers are wanting to do better, and the extension, their version of extension, is really cutting edge, maybe more so than private industry was there, was kind of my take.
Romolo, how would you compare it? You're a researcher and extension person here, and you've experienced both now. What are the similarities? Did you learn anything from them?
We're always learning, right? I think the biggest difference, let's start there, right, is that here the extension is mostly part of the university system, right, land grant system. So a faculty here is hired already with either an extension or research or teaching appointment, whereas there the universities haven't been as involved in extension historically. Now, recently there's been a mandate by the government that every single professor there needs to do extension as well, which I don't know that that's the way that we should go about it, because you either hire people specifically to do that, but you don't add that on top of people who are doing already research and teaching with very, very heavy loads of teaching. So the government is giving that a try through the universities more recently. But as Chris mentioned, perhaps because we don't have that as strong public extension system as it is here, some cooperatives like the one visited in Rio Grande do Sul are taking on themselves to do that and doing that very well. Also some private, right? We visited a research institution in the Mato Grosso region where they were just like a few fairly young professionals there doing their own research and working with companies and testing technologies and bringing that to the growers as well. So I think it is a mix. It's a good mix between some public, which is not necessarily tied to the university. Usually we have public institutions that are separate from research that do extension. Now there's a whole issues there, right? If you're not doing research, how can you do extension, right? So from the public side, I think we're not as nearly as strong as what we are here in the US. But there are either cooperatives or private that are doing that in a very similar way to what we do here in terms of field days and crop schools and apps and technology and so on.
Ken, you've served on the National Association of Wheat Growers Board. You've been close to public policy here in the U.S. To remain competitive and on the same playing field with Brazil in the future. What does the U.S. have to take a new look at? I mean, we've talked about restrictions that are holding Brazil back. What are the biggest things that are going to hold us back as we move forward?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask that of, but I mean, we have to look at our regulations and so forth all the time too. You know, I think somebody made a comment, regulations are necessary, but sometimes they get a little onerous and we just can't, you know, it holds us back in some ways. We've got we do have a good transportation system, but we've got to keep working on it all the time. I mean, I know there's been discussion about in the PNW, those folks are worried about, you know, some of the restrictions on what will end up going up and down the river system. They're concerned about that. I know that some of the locks and dams and stuff on the Mississippi are old and outdated, so we've got to be, I mean, some of that's not very exciting, but it's stuff that has to be done. We have to keep working on that stuff. We've got to keep working on research. I mean, that's, if there is a single answer to keeping us competitive, we're going to have to be finding new ways of doing things, have better genetics, better agronomic practices, which fits right in with what Romolo does here at the university. The thing that surprised me the most on that trip, and I guess I don't know what I was expecting, but we ran into K-State people all over the place down
Yes,
there.
we did.
And I know part of that was because of the connection with Romolo and with Carlos and Alex with the tour guides, but you know, there were a lot of people down there who had come up here, got their PhDs, and went back to Brazil. It seemed to me that they had a real commitment to education and to research and to bettering that situation. And I mean, we've got to keep doing that. I don't know if there's any silver bullet that we can change something that's going to, you know, change our situation, make us more competitive, but we've got to keep doing that stuff that we've been trying to work on for a long time.
Yeah, this is a wheat podcast, so I that's a nice segue to Biotrigo. They changed their company name, but they're a wheat breeding company in southern Brazil, Rio Grande do Sul. What state were they in?
Yeah, so Biotrigo, Rio Grande do Sul, they are by far today the largest wheat breeding company in Brazil. They have probably over 80% of the market share of the wheat land planted in country goes to one of their varieties. And it's interesting because André, who is one of the owners, or he was until they sold it recently, he is a K-State grad, right? He got his PhD here at K-State, and his brother, who is he was the other co-owner, got his PhD, I believe, in Idaho. And so both of them came to the U.S., got their PhD on wheat breeding, and went back and opened Biotrigo maybe, 20 plus years ago. And today they have 80+% of the market share.
Yes, and so Brazil imports most of their excess wheat needs from Argentina. They don't produce enough in far southern Brazil to meet their own needs. But at the same time, Andre had planned to move wheat production further north up into the Cerrado to try to make wheat production independent. So it certainly has implications for the U.S., a country that likes to export wheat to Brazil. So it is a little bit ironic that we've got a K-State trained wheat breeder down there who's trying to increase wheat production in one of the countries that we're trying to export to. So, well, same question to you, John. I mean, from a U.S. perspective, you see what's coming down the pipe here at Brazil. You know, if they do build a railroad, if they start building 4-lane highways, it's going to make them even more competitive and so much more upside potential. how do we stay on the same playing field with them here in the United States?
That's going to be very tough. That's going to be tough. After seeing what I saw on this trip, it's going to be very tough. The one thing that we constantly run into is currency exchange issues. When our dollar's strong, we can't sell as much product overseas. We've been the best looking horse in the glue factory as far as currency for years. I mean, nobody's got a really good economic situation now, I don't think, at least not that we've seen in, probably in the last 40 years. But our dollar has been so strong, it's really made it hard for us to compete on a foreign basis. As far as, I don't know how much wheat Brazil is going to produce. I know Argentina produces quite a bit. Brazil probably will produce more in time. Given the agronomic specifics of corn and beans and how we've got GMO, how we've got a lot of biotech components that work that help us produce more, I think that's where the greater upside is. And, wheat is a food crop and not a feed crop. And there's a lot of concern about a biotech wheat. So I don't know how much impact that will have on wheat as far as Brazilian production. But gosh, if they come up with a biotech wheat that has a consumer trait, that fights gluten intolerance or celiac disease or provides addresses obesity in some way, they're going to dominate the world market. They've just got the productive capacity to do so. If they get the transportation in place, it's going to be a very, very hard country to compete with.
They're certainly blessed with agriculture potential. We could turn it to a little bit of a lighter note. Romolo, Brazil is a beautiful country, a lot of green, but you get that with 80 inches of rainfall a year. Rolling hills in a lot of places, flat fields in a lot of places, even mountains in southern Brazil, which I was a little surprised by. But in a lot of ways, Brazil mirrors America in that it's a true melting pot, right? You yourself are of Italian background, and Rio Grande do Sul, we went to essentially an Italian town and had a great Italian meal at a restaurant. So your perspective as a Brazilian, I mean, what do you think the future is for Brazil in terms of agriculture? Do you have the same outlook that we have?
Yeah, no, as you mentioned, definitely a melting pot, right? We went to Dutch place as well, cities and German and so on. So that's the beauty of it as well, is just the diversity that we have down there in terms of background and ethnicities. In coming back to your question in terms of the potential, right? And I agree. I think that everything that I heard here in the discussion today aligns really well with what I see. Maybe what I would add is one thing that we saw quite a bit during the trip. We didn't visit any, but we saw here and there, which was those degraded pastures, right? So Brazil has over 430 million hectares of pastures in the country. And about 60% of those, or about 220 million hectares, they have some level of degradation, right? Whether it is fully degraded or halfway there or just starting. What that means is that if we could manage to intensify pasture, right, intensify forage production in current pastures, we could probably use a third of the area that we have today and still feed the same lot of cattle. So they still hold the same amount of cattle in about a third or 40% of the area that we use today because they're so degraded. And that would open up probably over 200 million acres of potential cropland without bringing down a single tree, right? So it's already been deforested, it's been under production for many years, but it's degraded and is really, really low productivity today. So if we find a way to use those degraded pastures for crop production, meaning fixing the soil, putting out lime, putting out fertilizer, building up profiles, and just intensifying pasture first so that it can actually hold same amount of cattle in a third of the land. Now you have 2/3 of that land where you can grow more cropland without bringing down a single tree. So I think that's a huge potential that we have, and if we find a way to use that, we could continue to increase our soybean production and corn production and other crops in the country. I always like to look back historically, and to me, historically, it might be 15 years ago when I was there, right? But at that point in time, I remember we were producing 65 million metric tons of soybeans, and that was a huge production year, 65, right? And today we're talking about 160 million. So that's almost 2.5 times more within 15 years, right? So the expansion was huge, and I think that the next big step, if Brazil wants to keep that level of expansion in production, will be to tapping into those degraded pastures that occupy a huge amount of the land, but are very low productivity as of today.
Well, that brings up another point, though. That requires a lot of fertilizer and a lot of lime, and just like much the U.S. has put itself in a position where we've offshored much of our fertilizer production, Brazil is pretty dependent on fertilizer imports. So that global marketplace, Chris, I don't know how much you visited with the local farmers, but what were you able to glean and compare input costs compared to your input cost in terms of, of fertilizers and pesticides and seed price? So I know land price was fairly pricey. I think we determined that it was about $9,000 per acre in Mato Grosso. But Chris, how would you compare the input side of it?
It would be pretty similar because, they talked about ROI a lot, and as a producer, there wasn't a lot there for the farmer. They were running, pretty lean and mean, and back to your point with Romolo, sitting here thinking about you start trying to bring degraded soils back into production and things, and all of a sudden your efficiency piece is gone, and your ROI is less on those acres. Yes, it'll be good to not knock down more trees, but for those acres to be productive, you can make them produce, but at what financial cost? And visiting with the farmers, a lot of things were lost to translation when it came right down to numbers, because once again, they were paying things in bags of beans. We're converting hectares to acres, and every farmer there had their calculator out trying to figure out what's the right metric to put on this. But when it came down to it, ROI was there. And I remember them specifically saying that ROI on soybeans was not so good currently due to the fungicide and pesticide applications and everything else. Freight was never mentioned in any of that. It was the inputs, and so it seemed to me that they were going to be focusing more on trying to increase corn yields because there was a better chance of return there than on the soybeans in this current market cycle.
Yeah, that's one thing about this trip. It was tough to compare apples to apples on this trip because there were so many conversions and different things and things lost in translation. So it was hard to get a decent comparison, I guess. Chris, just one follow-up with the poor soils that they have in Brazil, and we may not have as deep soils here in Kansas, but certainly a little bit healthier. Does it give you a new perspective or appreciation for the whole soil health movement here in the United States?
Through every disaster, every climate cycle, you always learn something, and agriculturalists, be it Brazilian or United States or anywhere, always seem to evolve to realize, man, how can we make this better? How can we retain our natural resource and stay productive and sustainable for generations? And I think we're both doing the same thing on each continent. I'm glad to be a no-till farmer. We had a 4-inch rain in Kansas this last fall, and I have a neighbor that went out and did full tillage on his ground this last year, trying to fill in some ditches and things. And after that 4-inch rain that fell within an hour, well, he would have been better off to take a vacation and not even mess with it. It all, you want to talk about erosion, and kind of made the comment, boy, I should have stuck with no-till. That was a big mistake. I guess the point I'm trying to make is we adapt and learn as time goes on to chase better ways to be better stewards of the land.
Well, let's get to some final thoughts here. Ken, we couldn't see everything in Brazil, obviously. It's a really big country. We scraped the surface in terms of agriculture. We haven't even talked about honey and coffee and oranges and sugarcane, or growing trees for paper production for that matter. So your next trip to Brazil, let's assume you're going back to Brazil. What do you want to seek out? What do you want to learn more about?
As I mentioned before, I was really fascinated by the Mato Grosso area, but the southern part, really 3 states that we kind of either went through or flew over or whatever, were really pretty. That was a beautiful area. If I was going there not to learn about agriculture, but to just soak things up and get immersed in the culture, I think I would head to the south end of Brazil, just based on what we saw. And I would go back, from a tourist standpoint, I would go back to Iguazu Falls in a second. That was breathtaking almost. We first got there, and you could just see a very little bit of it, and I thought, wonder what the big deal is about this. And the further we went, the better it got. Other than the fact that it was extremely hot and humid when we were there, that was really a neat tourist thing to see. I don't know. I'd probably like to visit some of the stuff in the city because we weren't in, and I'm not sure what all was there, but if I was headed back, that's probably where I would go. I think that was, like I said, the southern end of that, with the area that we were talking about with all the wineries and stuff. That was really beautiful. I mean, that was like a postcard almost.
Yeah, it was winter here in Kansas, and we did go to Brazil in summer, and we missed out on a couple of big things. Carnival started the weekend that we left in association with Lent, obviously, and then we also learned that the second largest Oktoberfest in the world is in Brazil, which surprised us a little bit too. Sorry we missed out on that. John, what are your final impressions? What would you see if you went back to Brazil?
Well, I'd like to go back in about 5, maybe 10 years, if I make it that long, just to see how much they will have advanced, because there's so many things in the works and so many things in transition, and it's fascinating to watch this. And, we hear so much about Brazilian beef, and I had one meal that was really good, but the rest of that, it was pretty tough, and I understand why. After seeing their feedlot operations, and they use Brahma cattle that can adapt, and they don't get paid for quality. They get paid for rate of gain. So the bulls, they fed bulls. They weren't steers. And so a lot of that, I imagine, is going to change. There's going to be some major changes in the next 5 to 10 years. But I full well expect that Brazil is going to continue on this trajectory and will be a major, if not the major, agricultural producer in the world.
Chris, what's your future say for Brazil?
The culture aspect I found to be fascinating. I guess farm generational transfer and the next generation coming up is what I would like to kind of watch and see in the next 15 years. I didn't hardly see any kids around. And we got to, looking around on Google, and, Brazil's reproduction rate is far less than the United States, and just kind of curious, right now, the efficiencies of the farm is because of an affordable labor pool. As that goes away and there's less kids to take the family farm over, and a lot of people moving more towards the city lifestyle, be kind of interested to see what it looks like in 15 years.
That is a great point. So they're in the greater Sao Paulo region, 30 million people. But do you think that's a challenge, Romolo, just like it is here in the United States, getting labor for agriculture?
I think so. I think that maybe immediately it's not, but as Chris very well put out, I think that it can be here in the near future, right? Part of it is the transitional between generations, right? The newer generation kind of getting out of the farm, and the farm being either sold out to larger farms or rented out. But also just like more and more people just wanting to move to the city and not necessarily be out there and working on the farm. So I think that can be a big challenge that we perhaps didn't talk about enough during the trip.
Well, let's wrap this up. It's fair to give you the last word here, Romolo. There's a lot of exchange of information between Brazil and the U.S., I think, in terms of education. You're a prime example of that, but exchange of information with farmers traveling back and forth to both countries. What do you think we can learn from each other?
Yeah, that's, some final thoughts here. I guess if I would think of maybe a couple of things that we, for some reason, couldn't see there during this trip, but could be interesting to put out there as well. One of them would be sugarcane production and processing, right? Not only the ethanol, but also sugar, right? And so we couldn't visit that because simply they were shut down for maintenance during January, February when we were there. So we couldn't really schedule that. And another big potential there is there could be a potential here too, but it's integration of forestry with pastures and crop production, all kind of within the same area where you have a much wider spaced trees growing for either paper or energy source or other things, with crops in between and then pasture in between, depending on the time of the year there as well. And so that type of integration could be very interesting for us to visit on a potential next trip there. In terms of things we could learn, right, from each other, I think that as a Brazilian coming up here, just learning about, again, the extension system that was developed here 100 years ago plus, it's a huge thing. And things that perhaps we're wanting to try and mirror there, without having the structure of the land-grant university, it's very hard for us to mirror. Another thing that as a Brazilian could learn is just like how you, as farmers here in the U.S., are contributing your checkoff dollars, and that's going back to research and actually being used to deliver information back to farmers, right? That's a system that is amazing here in the U.S. that we definitely in Brazil would have to learn from, because most of the research out there, either private, right, through companies, and then you're limited to just testing their products and technologies, or through public calls, not necessarily being funded by growers as it is here. So that's a huge thing that we could learn as well.
Okay, well that's a great stopping point. Romolo, thanks for sharing your country with us. It was great to have you on the trip as a tour guide. We could tell you were enjoying yourself very much on that trip.
Absolutely, I'm the one who thanks, and thanks Chris for getting this thing started back in 2019 or so when we visited the first time about this trip. And then I appreciate the opportunity to go there and visit with almost 40 Kansas growers and families and other friends. So
yeah. And gentlemen, thanks for your perspective on the trip. Thanks for taking the time to share that with everyone on this episode of the podcast.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to John Thamer, Chris Tanner, Ken Wood, and Romolo Lolato for joining us on this episode of the Wheats on Your Mind podcast to talk about Brazil. Remember, if you have a question about this episode or a topic you'd like us to cover in the future, please email us at podcast@kswheat.com. I'm Aaron Harries. Thanks for listening.